Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our session on By the Handbook, Staying Compliant in a Changing Environment. This session today is part of Lutheran Services in America's Strength and Service series, where we're laser focused on identifying and examining unintended consequences and uncertainty in today's environment. I'm pleased today to introduce our guest speaker, Beth Jones, Director of Ministry Solutions at Concordia Plans. For more than 50 years, Concordia Plans has offered plans to protect workers of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and the recognized service organizations by providing them with excellent benefits, comprehensive benefits, including health, retirement, disability, and survival, as well as wellness resources to support their emotional, financial, and physical well-being. Today's session is particularly timely because, as I understand it, even starting July 1st of this year, there are over 50 new laws that took effect in about 20 states. So the rules are changing very rapidly, and it's really important for all of us to stay on top of what they are in our particular jurisdictions. So today, Beth will share best practices in updating your handbook, provide guidance for either returning to the office or remaining remote, and discuss how you can stay up to date with some of the legislative changes. So we're going to have time for Q&A at the end, but please, as we're going through, we'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So please put your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them throughout the presentation. And if not during the presentation, then afterwards. So with that, I will introduce Beth.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be sharing my screen, but before I do that, I wanted to start with what my first experience was with handbooks. So I was a brand new individual right out of college almost 20 years ago, and I had just gotten my degree in human resources. And I just started with a Fortune 100 company in their HR department. So like my first real job. And I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to like rock the world, right? Or at least the HR world. And so I'm at this Fortune 100 company, and all these people are introducing themselves, and this gruff HR representative comes over, drops a box on my desk and said, "You're going to need this. Good luck," and walked away. We'll call him Tony. Inside the box was a whole bunch of like stress balls and some essential oils to help with headaches. Tony had just gotten off a massive project to redo the handbook for that Fortune 100 company, which operated in 48 states and had over 35,000 employees. So I don't know if that's what did Tony in, because he quit shortly thereafter. But I can definitely say I understand that handbooks are fast-paced, they're can be stressful and can be complicated. And they're not a favorite thing to do for me. They're not a favorite thing for any HR professional, even if that's maybe what they completely focus on. And so I'm really excited today to give some thought leadership on some best practices for handbooks. The interesting thing about handbooks is they're not even actually in most cases required, but so many organizations do them. So they're not always legally required, but almost most organizations have them, almost all actually. And it is considered a best practice. Why is that? Well, it's kind of like flossing your teeth. Nobody really enjoys flossing their teeth, but it does prevent major pain later on. And that's why you do a handbook for the most case. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to start by looking at when have you done your last handbook? Okay, 1 second here. Okay, so we recently asked some of our ministries. We know ministries need help. Most small and medium businesses don't have a large HR team, if they have an HR person at all. That would be formally trained in HR. And so we recently asked some of our ministries, when was the last time they updated their handbook? And most of the ministries that responded said it's been several years. We've heard the gambit, though, when we're talking to ministries of all different sizes, some of them 10 years. We don't have one. We have one that we copied from a friend or from a colleague that they gave me, something I found online. So then my next follow-up question at a recent conference was, how many of you are confident that your handbook is compliant? And not a single hand was raised in that webinar or in that meeting with those ministries. Instead, there were a lot of nervous glances. It's not something that people enjoy, but it's just so fast paced. As Charlotte indicated earlier, more than 50 laws took effect as of July 1st this year alone, and more are pouring in. So it is something that you have to have a focus on to make sure that you are compliant. In today's session, we're going to be talking about a couple different things. Now, many of you are here because you understand a handbook is needed, but I'm going to go over why it should be a priority, especially this year. Today, I'm going to share with you some of handbook best practice, some do's and don'ts to consider, and some recommendations on where you may want to start to focus if you're behind on revisions, or if you don't even have a handbook, some key areas to start, so that if you're having to eat that hippopotamus, you're eating it one bite at a time. Then I'm going to give you a really high level overview of a resource we have that could help. Now, before I do that, I just want to give you a quick disclaimer. Today, I'm going to provide you with general information. It isn't legal advice. The info I provide to you, it isn't intended to be your sole source of information for your ministry, but rather prompt you to consider and look into some of the areas that we cover further. So first and foremost is, what can an effective handbook do? From the employee side, it sets expectations on how employees should behave and be treated. And it can provide a peace of mind to a lot of employees, not only about the benefits they have, but even some of the protections that they have available to them and some of the processes they would have. Sometimes you get maybe a nervous Nelly, or they're navigating a new situation, they're pregnant, or they have a family member that's sick, and they hear horror stories in the news of organizations that don't treat them well. And so if they have a policy and a handbook on how to request leave, that does help alleviate stress. The other thing that it does from the employee is it tells them where to go if they need more assistance, especially when you're looking at harassment or discrimination or problems with leadership, which you want them to have empowerment to take those internal avenues so they don't seek outside resources. Knowing what to expect rather, alleviates stress, misunderstanding, and job satisfaction. An example of having a well-written policy, one organization I worked with had a non-exempt population, and they had a points system for an attendance policy. So if you missed a day, you'd get a point. If you missed a half a day, you get a half a point. By having the policy articulated in their handbook, that really helped eliminate or reduce issues of discrimination or feeling like their manager was picking on them, because it gave them a sense of fairness. If you have a great policy written in your handbook, it is really a best practice, and it can be used as kind of curbs in the road to help reinforce the culture, things that you won't tolerate, or things of how you want to treat employees. And that can also lead to attraction and retention of talent. Now, on the employer side, it reduces risk. Not only in legal risk and associated exorbitant amount of legal fees or fines, but also reputational risk of the ministry, of the community, the members, the leadership team, and your employees, current and future employees. Because in this day and age, it's hard to recruit good talent. And if you get a reputation for not being of employer choice, it can be really hard to recruit. An example I had heard recently was Amazon. And this was a few years ago. I don't know if any of you guys caught this, but Amazon had actually had some employees come and do a press release that in one of their warehouses, they had put an ambulance outside for when they're overworked employees in the heat. If they passed out, they could take them to a hospital rather than pay for air conditioning or give them ample breaks. And I don't know if you've followed Amazon, but they've had quite a bit of pressure lately for delivery drivers and some other circumstances. but it is a hindrance for them to hire. And so that's just one recent example. From the employer's perspective, because standards are written and employees are treated consistently, it does result in less formal complaints usually. If there are complaints and there is an internal avenue to work through them, there's less employees that feel like their only recourse is to get an attorney or file a complaint. Now, a quick list of possible policies that you could do. I just kind of quick made this list one rainy afternoon. There's even more that you could consider, but I wanted you to just kind of spot check, like what kind of policies might you have in a handbook. This isn't a full list. I thought of a few extra even while I was reviewing my notes to present, like social media policy would be a relevant one, or inclement weather. Does your ministry need every one of these? Probably not. Each ministry's needs are going to differ depending on your industry or the type of ministry that you are, where your ministry is located, specifically the state. So some states will have specific requirements, sometimes the city that you're in, or like if you have if you're a government contractor. Some depend on how many employees you have, or and even if you are only going to do a handful of these policies, keeping up with them for changes or revisions or changing interpretation of those different laws that impact those policies is a bit challenging. So if you are behind or need to revise some of your current policies, these are the 4 areas I'm going to dig a little deeper in. If you have a handbook, I would recommend that you start with these 4 if you haven't looked at it in a long time, or if you're just brand new and you can't start to write an entire handbook. These areas were selected because of the amount of changes that have happened or are expected to continue to happen. So they warrant them being front and center because it's a hot topic, such as the pandemic, health and safety. It's where the focus has been in the past from enforcement agencies and is predicted to continue to be a focus for the Biden administration, which is focused on worker rights, similar to what the Obama administration had, or the amount of risk or exposure employers could have, not only from a legal perspective, but also from reputational risk or employee morale, which can impact your attraction and retention of workers. So that's why those 4 were selected. They're not the only 4 areas that you might need to do some different policies or handbook revisions, but it's just a starting point. So let's deep dive in those a little bit more. So the first one is anti-harassment and discrimination. And there are not many employers that can make the case that they don't need an anti-harassment or discrimination policy. Under the federal law, Title VII would apply if you have 15 or more employees. There are very many states that also have specific anti-harassment and discrimination laws as well. And even if you were not compelled by a state law or Title VII, most HR professionals would still recommend that you have a policy because of the reputational risk. Now, simple statements about equal employment opportunities for all are generally not enough to give you protection in a ministry. And that's probably one of the more common things I see is there's just kind of like a disclaimer in their hiring process, or like a two-sentence paragraph in a handbook that they have. Generally, that's not going to be robust enough to offer your ministry any type of protection. Couple things that I would recommend besides the policy being robust is carve out sexual harassment specifically. And then you want to define what sexual harassment is or discrimination is. So for example, you'd say something like sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination. And then you would maybe talk about like what's quid pro quo, which is like this for that would be an example of that. So an example of that would be, I will give you overtime hours if you go on a date with me, if I'm a leader. You're going to outline the process for someone who believes they're the target to report a concern. You want it to be really clear, who should they go to? And this person should be more than one person in case the head person of the ministry is the one who is accused. you should probably have an alternative, either a board of directors or someone else on staff, so that there is an alternate, or if that person they're supposed to report it to is on vacation. You should also train those people who they're supposed to take those complaints so they know what to do. That they either have to turn it over to an investigative board, or maybe if you do have an HR team, maybe you have a point person that would initiate an investigation. You also should train your managers on what they should do if they receive a complaint of harassment. Now, specifically, recently in the news, the Cuomo harassment stuff just came out in the news from New York. And if you're ever bored or want to fall asleep, there's a 165-page sexual harassment investigation report out on the internet. But one of the interesting things is in the Cuomo case, one of the first complainants did report this to leadership in that organization in the state, and the leaders decided they didn't report it to, it would be like the equivalent of a government HR department, because the employee said, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, or I didn't want to report it. You want to compel all your leaders that they have to report it, and that the employee can't say, well, I don't want anyone to know. You need to make sure that you investigate. So just wanted to call that out. The other thing that you need to do is outline your retaliation. Now, it's very common to see something in your policy that says we don't tolerate retaliation, but you should go a little bit further, saying something, you protect witnesses or participants, that you have a fair process for both who's accusing and the accuser. I'm sorry, I said that awkward. Who is accusing and then who is accused, a fair process. And when you're talking to people who are participating, you should remind them of the retaliation protections that they have, and give them examples of what retaliation might be and who to report that to. Retaliation is, if not the most common charge by the EEOC, it's one of the most common charges. The EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that's the enforcement agency for Title VII. A recent example that I found from a couple years ago from Radio Shack in 2013, they got really dinged on the retaliation piece. Actually, it wasn't even so much as the discrimination, but they had a Radio Shack employee that had alleged age discrimination, and 1 week later they let that person go, terminated them. Well, the EEOC and the fine, it was $675,000 because of the retaliation piece. So retaliation is a component that's super critical when you're writing that policy that you address. When you're looking at harassment and discrimination, you also want to not only consider adverse treatment, which is kind of what I have this slide addressing as harassment or discrimination, but you also want to look at adverse disparate impact, which means that you're disproportionately impacting people in a protected class. And so sometimes it's because you have maybe a neutral policy or practice, but you don't realize that it's impacting certain minority populations. It may not be intentional. It could be like a sloppy hiring practice. Where I've seen some ministries or employers struggle is with pre-employment testing that they do for candidates. If you're going to do that, you need to make sure that it's validated, that it actually shows that that will be success in the role. And where I've seen one particular employer I worked with struggle with this is they actually had a validated pre-assessment test, but to save money, they didn't want to buy one for a different role, and it was not validated for the second role. So if you ever do any pre-assessment testing, ask that vendor to show you what their validation is and for the role. So one call out. Another thing for harassment and discrimination that I'd group in here is dress code is kind of becoming more and more common, where some of the states are writing some specifications in addressing protecting hairstyles for protected classes. So make sure that you don't have a dress code that hinders certain protected classes in a certain way, or also look at men versus women and what you're requiring, and if it really is a legitimate organizational need for them to have differences. The next one we're going to talk about is leave, and leave has gotten much more complicated in 2020. You're probably aware of the leave under the FFCRA that expired in 2020, but there are some tax credits that remain into 2021. On top of FFCRA, multiple states have issued leave mandates to help workers with COVID-related leave. But there's also other types of leave that went into effect this year that are not related to COVID. So you'll want to know what are some of those state requirements. Most employers are finding that having just a general PTO policy is not sufficient. So if there is a state or federal requirement for leave for you, which usually what will trigger that is the number of employees you have, you should probably call those out special and indicate what is provided to your employees. For example, some different types of leave are Family Medical Leave Act. Some states have a specific state-specific family medical leave or emergency leave. There's bereavement. Some states are doing domestic abuse or sexual assault or crime victim leave. Some of them even allow leave for kids, kid functions. So like if someone needs to go to a parent-teacher conference, that could be a leave. A couple things to make sure you have in your policy is to talk about the eligibility and what the leave is for. So if it's for a serious medical condition, if it's for the self or family, and list the family members. And keep in mind, some states determine different family members. So sometimes in-laws are covered, sometimes not. Sometimes it has to be a married spouse. Sometimes it could be a domestic partner. Sometimes there's coverage for what's called in loco parentis, which means it's not a formal biological or formal relationship. Like for example, my aunt raised me, but not on paper, but my aunt is sick. I might be able in some states to take leave to now take care of my aunt. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also, you should talk about if the leave is paid or unpaid. And if it's paid, who's paying for it? If they have to file for short-term disability, or they have the option of maybe a PTO bank or a vacation bank, that kind of thing. You could have multiple leave sections between federal and state if you're a larger employer. And sometimes those leaves can run concurrently. And one thing you could consider in your policy is to indicate if you intend to run them concurrently when applicable. So one example where it would be common is in the state of Wisconsin, there was the Federal Family Medical Leave Act for employers that have more than 50 employees. But Wisconsin also has a Wisconsin Family Medical Leave Act. And generally, with a few rare exceptions where one leave won't cover a specific circumstance, but the other does, most employers will probably run those leaves concurrently. So you'll just want to know and kind of specify that. Another call out here on the leave one is that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which applies to any employer that has 15 or more employees, sometimes a reasonable accommodation is additional leave beyond what a state or federal program like FMLA would provide. So just kind of keep that in mind. Or even if you don't qualify as a covered employer under Family Medical Leave Act because you don't have 50 employees, if you have 15, you might have to give them leave as a reasonable accommodation. Okay. The next section is mission and values. And with secular organizations and many organizations, they call it a code of conduct. So I definitely think this is one that you should put in there. And these are really custom to your ministry of what's important into your ministry. It upholds the values that you want, or kind of those curbs in the road of how you want employees to be treated. I don't recommend that you have a laundry list of everything that's prohibited, but most employers will kind of list some examples sometimes, or about the types of behaviors like respect, integrity, that kind of thing. If you are a ministry, some of our ministries, like a church body or a school where they're teaching the faith, some of them have a moral code, morality code, or they might call it something else, but it's a statement of the impact of the faith and living out the faith in your day-to-day life, and that you're promoting the faith and not living contrary to our deeply held religious or scriptural standards. So some ministries would need that. Depending on the type of ministry you are, you may not need that. But this is really helpful when you need to sometimes move to an immediate discipline situation and maybe not want to go through like progressive discipline because something major occurred, because it would violate the mission and vision of your values. So give you an example where I've helped some ministries is a worker took youth that they were mentoring and volunteering with to a drive-in movie theater and encouraged the youth to hide in the back to avoid paying. So basically kind of stealing the admission. So that would be something that was kind of a struggle. Someone who falsifies a leave form or medical documentation. I also had a worker that mentored and supported youth, and they took them to dinner at an establishment that was inappropriate to take children, where women were sexualized and immodestly dressed. And so the parents of these kids and some of the kids were uncomfortable seeing some of that information. So that was something where the ministry needed to move on it immediately since they worked with youth. All right, so on pandemic health and safety, there's at least 14 states that have adopted COVID-19 worker safety protections, and that's kind of a moving target on guidance, as you know. Many thought leaders in the HR space are predicting a lot of employee claims for retaliation for raising health and safety concerns. And sometimes it's quite confrontational with people feeling so passionately about different sides. There's a lot to navigate here. I have a list of different policies that you may have done some of these, or maybe you need to focus on some of these or want to consider to focus on some of these. And a couple of the call outs that I have in this section, and then we're going to kind of deep dive in some considerations to think about whether you're staying remote or going to return. And so it's planned effectively. But a couple of things that I'd call out is how do your COVID processes or procedures affect your normal policies? So if you have a strict attendance policy, does that maybe deter employees for being honest if they have symptoms, and then they might come into the office and infect workers? So you might want to suspend an attendance policy temporarily, or reassure employees that generally we want you in 2 days a week, but if you have symptoms, you know, we're going to be flexible. We want you to come forward with that. And tell us so that you don't come in and infect people. Better to be safe than sorry. A couple more things to call out on here for returning or remote staff. So these are some different ideas that you might want to think through. Many employees that have had a taste of working from home do not want to give it up. So I'm seeing studies coming in through a lot of different HR organizations, some of them as high as 65% of employees want to have some level of working remote. So it can be a really great attraction and retention tool, but there's just a couple things I want to call out that you want to think through so you don't kind of get stuck with a surprise. It does expand your potential candidate pool. So if you're having a hard time struggling or find someone passionate, you can start recruiting in other areas if they have the ability to work from home all the time. So it could increase diversity and diverse hiring, which is always a good thing. You can, if you do decide that you're going to continue to work remote or keep that permanent, or even temporary, actually, some of the things you can do is integrate it into wellness conversations that you've had with staff, that maybe the money they're saving from a commute or daycare or strong care type things could be go towards student loan repayment, or perhaps you have a 403B. We have student loan payment programs and a 403 program, but you should talk to your teams about that, because that might be a good strategy for them to take advantage of. A couple other things that I would have you think about is the physical location of staff can trigger a need for new policies, new practices, benefits, or tax implications. And I don't think, if you have an employee move and they just go just over the border of a state, or, sometimes we're hearing employees like up and switch states completely and just moved on the employer. And we don't always think about what some of the ramifications of those are. So at a high level, employers may be required to withhold or remit new state or city taxes that they didn't have to do before. And you might have to register for that city or the state that your employee is in. Different states have different privacy laws, different benefit differences. So for example, if they're in a different state, you can't just assume that your current state or where most of you are is the policy that would be the overriding policy for that employee, because it's usually where they have boots on the ground. So you might be forced to let an employee accrue time off, or you might be forced to provide short-term disability, or you might have to have different leaves programs and why they can take leave or for who they can take leave. You might have to pay out accrued leave. Colorado just passed a new law where if people are accruing vacation, you can't use it or lose it. You have to pay it out upon termination. Sometimes there's expense reimbursement changes. So for example, we're here in Missouri, and if we have employees that are living just over the border in Illinois, Illinois requires reimbursement for like internet and some other expenses from working from home. So then how will you handle that? Will you provide that for all workers, or just in those states that maybe you have a worker relocating to? Other things to think about if they move a little bit further away is how will you pay for travel and make sure that you and the employee are all set. For example, if they move 20 miles away, does the employee know you're not paying for mileage for them to come into the office, if that's your plan? But if they move 4 states away, are you ready to pay when they have to come in for hotel and airfare? So just make sure you guys are all on the same page with that. A couple other things regarding that section is that minimum wage and sometimes salary thresholds are different state to state. There is a federal requirement, but some states have different requirements. So you'll want to look at that, especially if you have lower paid workers. And then another consideration with pay is if you do have people relocate to other states, will you impact your pay bands if they're in a geographical location where it's more expensive to live, like Chicago or San Francisco, or is the pay band and you're not going to modify that? So that's a philosophical question that you and your leadership team might need to have. From a recruitment perspective, it could change how you recruit if you do want to recruit across multiple states. So there are 17 states and 20 localities, at least the last time I checked, that ban salary history. So if your application or hiring process is asking what their current salary is, just kind of be aware that there's a lot of states that ban that. And I think more are going to probably continue to follow suit. Many states have a ban the box on applications. There are exceptions if you're working with vulnerable populations sometimes, or hiring certain positions, but just so you're aware of that. And another thing that's changing really fast is marijuana laws across the states for either medical marijuana or recreational. So if you do a pre-employment drug test and they're in one of the states where that's allowed, you might have to change your practice for those pre-employment drug tests. And then keep in mind that you need to do some reasonable accommodations sometimes for people if they have a major medical condition. So if you have someone who doesn't want to return to the office and tells you, I'm not comfortable, I don't want to come, that's the point to start having a conversation about the why. If they do have a major medical condition, to see if there's an accommodation that you could do. Maybe they work from home for a bit, or you move their desk to maybe less trafficked area, provide PPE like gloves or an N95. That could look very different from ministry to ministry. I'm going to jump back up to hybrid models and rotations in the office. So some ministries and employers have pushed back returning to work because of the new variant. Some are forging ahead and coming in. Some are setting schedules up so there's less people in the office, or they've had the ability to spread out. So if parts of teams are impacted, it's not everyone on the team, kind of like a schedule A, schedule B, that kind of thing. It is hard when you have remote staff, either permanently, or it feels like it's permanent if it's been 1.5 years, but semi-permanently, to keep a common culture and have people feel like they're part of the team and they're part of that mission. And so some different things that you can think about is some tech that you could launch if you haven't already. I mean, there's things like Zoom, Slack, Teams, but I've seen some success with some organizations that have had informal stuff like virtual coffee, where the entire team just 15 minutes every Monday, get coffee, jump on, and they just talk. So it's kind of like water cooler talk, which is a really low budget thing to have people feel connected, and it's not a lot of pressure. or like schedule a lunch, a virtual lunch once a month, or especially with new people so that they just get to meet some people informally. So there's some creative things you can do outside of the box to still connect. You can implement some listening processes like surveys, or even like, listen to the water cooler, kind of roam the floor to see how it's going. You'll also want to set some norms if they're going to continue to work from home long-term, permanently, or even temporary if you're already back and are thinking of going back out. What are their normal hours? Can they change their schedule or leave in the middle of the day? Do they have to send notes out if they're going to be not available during normal business hours? You'll want to look at what are the rules for the camera culturally? Do you require the camera on or off? And dress code when you work from home. I know, I'm sure you've all seen the memes or heard some of the people in the news that were improperly dressed on all parts of their body. And some of that was not intentional to be shown on a Zoom meeting, but you want to make sure people know, like, is athletic wear okay if they're interacting with the public, or do they still have to do business casual? So I think there were some people who maybe haven't had clear guidance yet from an employer on that. And I think we've all had maybe a meeting with someone externally and you're a little taken back at how casual it could be. Couple other things for the home office is, can the employee purchase products that they need for their home office? And if so, what's your threshold? Can they buy a desk? Are they responsible for their own desk? Can they buy their own paper, toner? Are you going to supply it? Does their office need to be ergonomic? If you're going to do it long-term, you might want to set some guidance on certain types of desks, or, how to make sure it's the right height so that you're avoiding long-term carpal tunnel and those types of things. If they have protected information, like HIPAA related things because of what they're working on, do you require a door and a shredder? If they have roommates or live with other people, that is a real concern that people walking by could hear that. So how do they secure that? You'll want to also set expectations or norms on childcare. Are they required to have childcare if they continue to work from home permanently? There's two camps on that. Some will require that, and some people will say it's not always necessary if the kid is 11 and pretty self-sufficient, right? So that really is a philosophical thing. And then the new thing that's kind of the causing a conundrum is pets. And it seems like that'd be a minor thing, but many people got pets during the pandemic, or their pets got used to them. And so some employers are allowing employees to bring pets into the office. So if you do that and you want to be pet friendly, you'll want to set a policy on pets, like they have to be vaccinated and potty trained. That they're responsible for damage if it steals lunches, right? That was a real story. Someone said it's working out great, but sometimes they steal Freddie's lunch. So make sure you're thinking through that too, if other employees maybe have allergies. So on to vaccinations, we can have an entire webinar on vaccinations and do you mandate or do you encourage, and some of the benefits of that. The two things that I would just say about vaccination for the time that we have today is to really consider your culture in your workforce, and maybe talk to someone if you're not sure if you want to mandate or encourage that, because you're probably not pleasing everybody, right? And in some places, it looks like states are limiting employers in some regard on that. And the other thing that I would tell you about vaccines is, do you really need to keep vaccine records, like see a vaccination card? I can't tell you the answer because it probably depends on what kind of ministry you are. But one thing I found employers don't realize is if you collect copies of the vaccination records, it's considered a medical record, and you have to keep that in a locked medical file where it's secured away from their employer file. And then OSHA requires you to keep those records for 30 years. Which is a very long time. So just really be purposeful if you need to keep that type of information. Okay. A couple of best practice do's. Make sure that it's a living, breathing document. It's not a one and done. So it's not like you do it and then you never have to do it ever again. Make sure that you're communicating it to people. If you adjust it, it's almost guaranteed if you haven't worked on it in a year that it is past due. A couple times you might want to update it off cycle is if there's a law or regulation change. You can't wait, like I said, but also impactful current events is a time to refresh people's memories. Like when it's a voting year, to send out a communication and make sure your policy is up to date before you send it. Or we saw a lot of policies get adjusted in when the protesting was happening to just remind people they protest on behalf of themselves, not always necessarily on top of the organization. Also, if you have a change in leadership and you need to update who they need to report concerns to, you'll want to have employees look at it to make sure they understand it and always have a second set of eyes. It's not always about law changes, but sometimes court determinations, a change of direction on guidance, or government enforcement agencies can issue a letter of opinion, guidance, or clarification that can warrant you changing your policy. So just be aware of that. A couple other do's, just make sure that you're communicating and you're training to it, especially on the harassment. That's kind of a huge one. Make sure leaders know what their requirements are for the role, what they need to do. The sexual harassment training sometimes varies state to state. They do get pretty nitty gritty in some states about what you have to include in the training, how long the training has to be, the style of the training, and who is a qualified trainer. So just make sure you're aware of that and that you keep documentation of training attendance and acknowledgement of policies. One thing I thought was interesting with the Cuomo recent example is they only had him doing training 1 year and actually had someone else do it. So make sure everybody in the organization is doing it. Few quick don'ts. Don't make it a contract. Don't try to put every single thing that you can think of that someone might do wrong in there. You don't want to box yourself in. So you're going to use language like generally, up to and including. Some examples include but are not limited to. So keep that in mind. Be careful on infringing on NLRA protections, which is National Labor Relations Act, especially because employees might complain about work conditions, including safety. That's protected concerted activity. So just make sure you kind of stay away from that. And don't use another ministry's handbook. You guys have different cultures, different number of employees, different states, different cities. If you take it from them, it might not be up to date and you may actually be doing more harm than good. Now I'm going to really quickly just show you a high-level overview of the service we do have that you would have access to if this would help alleviate some of that administrative burden and mitigate your risk. There is more information on concordiaplans.org/HR. One of the things that I'd call out is there is an HR fitness quiz, which is like 5 minutes to take, if that, and it gives you a printout on kind of maybe some areas to focus in on. But there is some more information about the service that we have. And through Concordia, we partner with a HR professional organization called Mineral, and Mineral's been around and serves over 365,000 current churches, nonprofits, ministries, and schools, as well as secular organizations. And with this service, they have a unlimited phone support as well as a platform where you can find out more information. The unlimited phone support is available from 7 a.m. to 7 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time, and they can handle questions for all 50 states. There's over 50 certified HR professionals certified through SHRM or HRCI, which are two of the bodies that do certifications for HR professionals, and they have attorneys on staff that monitor legal changes and set guidance. You can also submit questions in writing if you don't if you don't have an urgent issue or don't want to give them the phone call. And I have a quick few screenshots. I want to give us a little bit of time for some Q&A because I know that was important to the group. But a few quick screenshots about some things that the service has besides the call center. This is what our service looks like. And in the top right-hand corner, you can see COVID-19 Resource Center. That's huge. Right now, they just changed it actually just yesterday to returning to work, masking, and vaccine facts. So it's about 24 questions just on that are real common. But you can see the service is grouped by laws, topics, learning, tools, documents. So there is a repository of job descriptions, policies, if you want to see what one looks like. There's short videos to show you how to do stuff if you don't know what to do for like a government form or how to fill out a 9-9. There's checklists and Q&A section. So pretty much anything you could want from a resource is available there. One of the cool things about this is the handbook builder, which comes with 3 different ways to process those. The first one is just a simple handbook builder, and they'll just give you within 30 minutes, kind of like a quick one if you want. But you also can do a professional handbook builder, which comes with a free consultation with a certified pro and gives you a custom handbook for your ministry based on the state you're in. And if you have multi-state, they can handle multi-state and federal law. So based on the number of employees that you have, or you can submit individual policies to that service. This is a screenshot on the right-hand side of just some templates for job descriptions, policies, and forms. They also do law alerts and give you some best practice in your email. So every month you'd get a couple emails. The one on the left is HR Snapshot, which is common questions or sometimes just in time, like COVID has been a huge component of that over the last year. And then on the right is a federal law alert. And then the monthly HR advisor usually is topical. This one was on requiring COVID-19 vaccines and just some things to consider. And then if the service is something you're interested in, I'll give you my email address in a little bit if you'd like more information, but the service is only $49 a month, regardless of how many times you call them or how many questions you have or how big your ministry is. So I hope that I convinced you that handbooks are crucial and that policies should be accurate and applicable, and that we are here if you would like any further assistance. And if you do require any further assistance or would like any more information, I've got my email address on the screen and the web page for additional information for after the fact. And with that, I think, Chris, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Beth. That was extremely informative. Yes, if anyone does have any questions, please do feel free to either type it in the chat box or go off mute if you'd like to say so verbally. Well, while we are waiting, we do have one question. If you have multiple locations, would you recommend one handbook or a separate one for each? And if one handbook, should you have separate sections for special policies applicable to certain locations?
There, put my video on. Yeah, that's a good question. So it really depends on how many differences there are going to be between your locations or how many states you have. And you actually have some options as an employer on how you would do that. So the first one is you could do multiple versions by state or locations. You basically have a couple different handbooks and you just took a standard, you modify it for each state. That's if there are a lot of different variability from state to state. You could do a single handbook and you just have your state and local differences kind of highlighted in topical sections. So everything's the same except for leave. And then in the leave section, you're like, Wisconsin employees, this is for Alabama employees. Or you could put your state specific in the addendum. So you could say, you know, we have the following federal leave programs, and then there are some state ones, see the addendum at the back. So you actually have 3 different ways you could probably do it.
Thank you, Beth. One other question. You know, you're talking about how organizations really don't want to copy from each other. Each organization is going to be different. For smaller organizations, maybe you only have 4, 5, 6 different employees. Is it really necessary for an organization to have a full-blown, fully comprehensive handbook?
So it becomes more critical depending on what state you're in, because there are different requirements for each state. But I don't think you need to have a full-blown on steroid handbook where you're going to have all those policies like I listed on the first couple slides. but there are some basics that I would recommend that you have, specifically that touch base on discrimination and harassment, even if you only have just a couple employees. And there's a couple other ones too, where you might be required to do some things from the state. So it would be probably a pared down one. It's less complicated because you have less employees, but there are very many labor laws that you'd still want to comply with.
Makes sense. All right. And we have one question from Charlotte. Do you include performance reviews in the handbook?
So it's not an HR system where you would submit it through the system, but it does give you everything else you want. It gives you a couple different versions of off-the-shelf performance reviews that you could use, videos on how to do it, best practice, training documents to help train people. It does not push it through the system. We do have some payroll relationships with an actual HRIS if you need that type of functionality, but the service, especially for smaller organizations, can kind of give you some stuff off the shelf that you could use.
Okay, sounds good. And once again, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Well, if there are any outstanding questions, or if you need any additional information, I can be reached at ministrysolutions@concordiaplans.org. And thank you so much for letting me come and present.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Beth. And who knew that you have to keep vaccination cards for 30 years? That was definitely news, as was much of the other information provided, which is very valuable. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. Please join us again for future Strength and Service sessions. We'll be advertising those. And as Chris mentioned before, we will be sending out the slides along with a recording of this afterwards, along with contact information for Beth so you can reach her. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. Beth, thank you so much for the information. We really appreciate it. And everybody have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.